I'm David Lam, partner at international law firm King & Wood Mallesons. I'm pleased to be invited by the Asia Pacific Loan Market Association to talk about Yinfa No. 27 2022, the Notice on Offshore Lending Business of Banking Financial Institutions, issued jointly by the People's Bank of China and the State Administration of Foreign Exchange earlier this year, which we'll call PBOC 27. I'm delighted to be joined by Mr. Eugene Lau, Managing Director, Head of Capital Markets at China Construction Bank Asia. Eugene is also the Vice Chair of the APRMA and Chair of the China Committee of the APRMA. PBOC 27 became effective on the 1st of March 2022. There was a 3-month transition period which ended at the end of May 2022. This session is not meant to be exhaustive. We aim to look at PBOC 27 from the perspective of offshore syndication. First, let's look at the scope of PBOC 27. The keywords are domestic banks making offshore lending of RMB or foreign currency loans to offshore enterprises. There's a lot of information in there. Let me break it down into these 4 components. The first component, domestic banks, means PRC licensed banks with international settlement capability, which include PRC branches of foreign banks, and they have to complete their filing with PBOC and SAFE. However, the following are excluded: offshore branches of domestic banks, offshore banking units of domestic banks, which we usually call OBU, or segregated free trade zone account of free trade zone branches, which is not funded by RMB funding from head office. These 3 types are excluded from the application of PBOC 27. Secondly, offshore lending includes both direct and indirect offshore lending, where direct lending means lending to offshore enterprises directly, and indirect lending means the provision of funds to offshore banks with a term exceeding 1 year for the purpose of lending to offshore enterprises. There are exclusions too. Trade facilities in support of genuine international trade settlement are excluded when calculating the offshore lending limit, which we'll touch upon in a moment. The third component, RMB or foreign currency loans. It is an important feature because it is the first time offshore lending in RMB and foreign currencies is uniformly regulated. And the last component, the fourth one, offshore enterprises, means non-financial enterprises duly incorporated in regions outside PRC. In this juncture, while PBOC 27 has set out a schedule of 27 banks, which will have to complete the filing and regulated by PBOC and SAFE, what about the other banks?
Yes, PBOC 27 has mentioned specifically these 27 banks, but then for the other banks, they can also do offshore lending, and because in the past, and they always get a local SAFE to get approval. With PBOC 27, obviously this article is also published jointly by SAFE, and the local SAFE can also approve such lending with reference to PBOC 27. So this provides a regulation for all the banks, including those outside of these 27 names, to join the to join international syndicated loans. And as a matter of fact, in the past, there are some bigger banks, and they did offshore lending, but not the smaller banks. And the smaller banks, and because they don't want to breach legal or compliance risk. And now with PBOC 27, and they have the regulation to follow to the extent that they meet the requirements set out by PBOC.
So PBOC 27 is opening up a lot of opportunities for a lot of other banks who can participate in the business.
That's correct. And actually, I'm also getting the data from my Refinitiv friend. And in the course of the past 3 months, there are 12 deals closed with the involvement or participation of onshore bank or domestic banks. And so there are some repeated names, meaning that they are getting more active, and also there are some new names.
I see. Well, I think we can now look at the other elements of PBOC 27. We can look at loan purpose and the lending limits on offshore lending. Firstly, on loan purpose, financing expenditures within the business scope of offshore enterprises is permitted. But loan proceeds cannot be used for securities investment, transactions with fictitious background, other forms of speculative or arbitrage transactions, repayment of offshore debts under 内保外贷, or repatriation to PRC, including through inbound lending or equity investment. These are not allowed. Well, the last two restrictions are very relevant to structuring syndicated loan deals. And on lending limits, it is a domestic bank's net Tier 1 capital multiplied by offshore lending leverage ratio, which is 0.5 for most banks, multiplied by macro prudential adjustment parameter, which is currently 1. It is important to note that if the loan is in foreign currency, an exchange rate risk conversion factor, which is currently 0.5, shall be added to the weighting of the loan balance. This means that RMB lending is more favored and promoted in terms of this cross-border lending business. We have so far looked at some key features of PBOC 27. I would like to ask Eugene to share with our audience the potential practical implication on offshore syndication from a bank's perspective.
Yes, actually, a lot of banking friends are asking me whether this new regulation is going to create a new market or is going to steal away some of the market share of the existing banks. Put it this way, with PBOC 27, I think for sure that we'll be seeing more and more market players and from mainland China. And indeed, in the past, and for larger banks like CCB, and we have been doing, our mainland branches has been doing offshore syndication already. So with PBOC 27, we need to follow the regulations strictly. We need to have a strict policy and procedure in place. And then we can also take the lead to guide some of the smaller banks, some of the new players, and how they can join international syndication. And actually, it's also a matter of for syndicated loan, international syndicated loans, and we can include these so-called new phases, and then to make it a bigger market and to provide more liquidity, to fill more liquidity to the markets. And this will also help, and for example, the so-called the dual circulation of the China economy, and also to help, and for example, internationalization of the renminbi. Because with more and more onshore banks doing offshore loans, their strength is in renminbi financing. And then they get to know the international rules and regulations. And also for green, and for some of the ESG loans, and onshore bank will also be educated and to get to know the international green standard. So we are really hopeful that with these new players or newcomers, and that will make our markets bigger.
That's right. And well, we talk about direct lending and indirect lending. I understand that in the offshore syndication market, as you mentioned, there are lots of combination in the syndication comprising of offshore banks as well as onshore banks. And how do you see the PBOC 27 when they're talking about direct lending, so domestic banks lending directly to offshore enterprises, as compared with indirect lending? How do you interpret indirect lending in terms of the syndication business?
Well, and actually the interpretation is not from me, obviously, and it's from the regulator. And this is one area that I think the regulator, because this is a new regulation, and so the regulator need to elaborate a little bit more instead of the guessing by the markets. Because right now, and for Chinese banks generally, we do quite a bit of sub-participation. So the offshore branch, and we will be the lender on record, and we will also sub-participate the loans, whether to our onshore banks, or overseas branches. And then whether these onshore banks or onshore branch, when they participate, this will control as indirect lending is something to be clarified further by PBOC.
Right. Well, I think it is an area that we have to continue to look for the further developments. So I would say thank you very much, Eugene, for your insights. And I think, like, to wrap up this session, I will see that PBOC 27 has established a regulatory framework for offshore lending by domestic banks in all currencies, RMB or other foreign currencies. And market players should be mindful of the limitation on loan purpose of such offshore lending. And as Eugene mentioned, there will be interesting dynamics between offshore lenders and domestic banks in the offshore syndication market. And it's definitely worth continuing to look closely at this space for further development. And I think this brings us to the end of this sharing session. And thank you very much, Eugene, and thank you, APMA, for inviting us to this session. Thank you.
Thank you, David.